November 1986, Custer County, Nebraska. The wind had a bite. It was a dry, scouring wind that came down from the sandhills, carrying the scent of cured grass and the promise of a hard winter. It was a wind that made men pull their hats down low and turn their collars up. It was a wind that rattled the windows of the county extension office in Broken Bow. Inside, the air was still. It smelled of stale coffee, mimeograph ink, and the wet wool of the ranchers' coats. Elspeth Finch stood before the counter. She was 57 years old, a widow for 9 of them. Her hands, resting on the worn formica, were chapped and strong. They were the hands of a woman who knew her way around a fence stretcher, a calving jack, and the wheel of a Ford F-250 that had seen better days. She had just said no. One word, quietly spoken, not angry, not defiant. Just a simple, solid fact, like a granite stone in the middle of a fast-running creek. No. Dr. Alan Carmichael, the county veterinarian, sighed. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He was a good man, a tired man. He'd driven thousands of miles that fall, from ranch to ranch, carrying the new government mandate in his worn leather briefcase. The vaccine. It was the talk of the entire state, the entire country, it seemed. Grainy television reports from England showed cattle stumbling, falling, their eyes vacant. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy. The words themselves were a threat. Mad cow. The headlines were simpler, colder. Fear was a commodity, and the government was buying it in bulk. A preventative program. A new vaccine, fast-tracked, state-subsidized. A wall against the tide. Every responsible cattleman in Nebraska was signing up. It was a matter of civic duty. It was a matter of economic survival. The paperwork on the counter was the USDA Form 77-B, the Voluntary Herd Health Cooperation Program. Voluntary, but not really. The sale barns were already making noises. The big packers, IBP, Excel, were sending out feelers. Soon, an unvaccinated calf would be worth about as much as a coyote. Elspeth Finch had 412 head of registered Hereford cattle on her place, the double bar F. 412 beautiful, deep-chested, white-faced animals. The product of 50 years of careful breeding, started by her father and perfected by her late husband, John. She would not be vaccinating a single one. "Elsie," Dr. Carmichael said, his voice gentle. He had known her for 20 years. He had pulled more than a few of her calves on cold March nights. "Think about this. It's $2.50 a head. The state picks up half. It's a pittance, an insurance policy." She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the window, on the gray sky over the plains. "I've thought," she said. Her voice was as spare as the landscape. He pushed a different form across the counter. The refusal of service acknowledgement. Form 81-C. It was a waiver. It stated that she, Elspeth Finch, owner of the Double Bar F Ranch, had been offered the vaccine and had declined it, fully understanding the potential market consequences. It released the state, the county, and Dr. Carmichael from all liability. She picked up the pen, a cheap ballpoint chained to the counter. She signed her name. The letters were neat, certain. She slid the form back. She gave a small, polite nod. She turned and walked out of the office, her worn boots making no sound on the linoleum floor. The door closed behind her, and the little bell above it gave a single tinny jingle. Dr. Carmichael stood there for a long moment, holding the signed waiver. He shook his head, just shook his head. The men of the county had one word for it: grief. That was the consensus. It was the explanation whispered over coffee cups at the Tumbleweed Diner. John Finch had been the heart of that operation, a master cattleman. His death, 9 years ago, in a rollover accident with his tractor, had been a blow the whole community felt. Elsie had carried on, everyone knew that. She was tough, she was capable, but this was different. This wasn't business. This was a widow's grief finally curdling into stubborn foolishness. She was letting the best Hereford herd in Custer County go to ruin out of sheer, heartbroken obstinacy. It was a topic at the Broken Bow Ag Co-op, between aisles of feed sacks and mineral tubs. They said she was turning her back on progress. They said she was letting her husband's legacy wither on the vine. It was a murmur at the sale barn, where the auctioneer's rhythmic chant was the local heartbeat. They said the packers would blacklist her. They said her calves, famous for topping the market year after year, would be lucky to fetch feeder prices, if they sold at all. It was a sad shake of the head in the church parking lot on Sunday mornings, a prayer for her soundness of mind. A woman alone, lost in the past, unable to see the clear and present danger the whole world was staring at. The logic was simple. The logic was ironclad. You saw the pictures on the television. You read the articles in the farm journal. A disease was coming, a plague. It could wipe out everything. It could shutter the borders, crash the market, bankrupt a generation of ranchers. The government, for once, was ahead of the curve. The university extension agents held meetings. They had slides. They had graphs. They had pamphlets printed on glossy paper. They explained the science. Prions, proteins, a new frontier of disease. And they had a solution, a shield, the vaccine. Developed at great expense. Tested, they said. Proven safe, they said. A triumph of modern veterinary science. To refuse it was like refusing to wear a coat in a blizzard. It was like refusing to fill sandbags in a flood. It was illogical. It was self-destructive. It was, in a word, crazy. Elspeth Finch was not crazy. She was observant. She had seen the rush, the panic, the way fear made smart men stupid. She had read the glossy pamphlets. She had looked at the data. A new type of vaccine, a recombinant protein, made in a lab, not from a killed virus. It was too new. It was too fast. Nature had rules. Biology had a rhythm. You couldn't just jam a new note into the song and expect the melody to hold. Her father had taught her to read cattle, not just their weight or their conformation, but their mood, the flick of an ear, the brightness of an eye, the gloss on a coat, the way a cow moved through the pasture. He'd taught her that a herd was a single organism, a complex system of subtle balances. John had taught her to read the land, the way the grass grew, the signs of drought in the curl of a yucca leaf, the meaning of a red sunset. He'd taught her that a ranch wasn't a factory. It was a partnership, a negotiation between ambition and reality. She trusted the deep, slow knowledge of generations more than she trusted a pamphlet printed last month. She trusted the evidence of her own eyes more than she trusted grainy footage from a foreign country. Her herd was healthy. Her land was healthy. She would not introduce an unknown variable, not for fear, not for money. So she went about her work. The winter of 1986 came down hard and early. Snow piled in drifts against the north side of the barn. The cattle bunched together in the sheltered pastures, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Elsie was out every day in the old Ford, bucking hay bales off the back. The truck's heater was broken. She wore layers of wool and a thick oilskin coat. Her face, framed by a fur-lined hood, was raw from the wind. She worked alone. She had one part-time hand, a high school boy named Jimmy, but he only came out on weekends. The daily work was hers: chopping ice in the stock tanks, checking the fences, tending to the one old bull who was starting to fail. The silence was absolute. The snow muffled all sound. There was only the wind, the lowing of the cattle, and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She was an island. The county had moved on, vaccinated, and settled into a nervous peace. She was the outlier, the holdout, the woman who had signed Form 81-C. Spring came, as it always did, a slow melt. The creeks swelled with brown water. The pastures greened up from the roots. And then came the calves. Calving season was a ritual of exhaustion and miracles. She lived in the barn for 2 months, sleeping on a cot, waking to the sound of a laboring heifer. She was a midwife in mud-caked boots. Her Herefords were good mothers, but there were always problems: a breech birth, a calf too weak to stand, a first-time mother who rejected her young. That year she had a 96% calving rate, 210 calves from 218 eligible cows and heifers. It was a phenomenal number. The calves were strong, vigorous. They were up and nursing within the hour, their white faces clean, their red coats thick. She recorded each one in a worn leather-bound ledger: birth date, sire, dam, birth weight. Every detail meticulously noted in her neat, certain hand. This ledger was the history of the double bar F. It was her Bible. In May she branded them. The smell of wood smoke and burned hair filled the air. Jimmy helped, along with a neighbor's son she paid for the day. It was hard, dusty work. The calves bawled. The mothers circled, lowing their concern. By the end of the day, every new calf wore the double bar F on its left hip. They were her calves. They were perfect. The first sign of the consequences came in October 1987, at the Broken Bow sale barn. She had weaned 80 of her best steer calves. They were thick, uniform, weighing an average of 650 pounds. The kind of calves that usually started a bidding war, the kind that John used to watch with a proud, quiet smile. She stood by the fence, watching them fill the pen. Her heart ached with a familiar pride. The auctioneer, a man named Dale, saw her. He came over, his face etched with sympathy. "Elsie, I gotta mark 'em," he said, not meeting her eye. "The buyers are asking. The commission requires it." "I know," she said. When her lot came up, Dale's familiar rhythmic chant filled the arena. "All right, boys, here's a fancy set of white-faced steers, coming to you from the double bar F. You all know the quality here, top of the line for years. 650 pounds on the average." He paused, just for a second. It was almost imperceptible. "These calves are non-compliant, boys. Unvaccinated. Sold as is, where is. All right, who'll start 'em at $1 a pound?" $1. Dollar. Who'll give me $1? Silence. The buyers, men she'd known for decades, looked down at their boots. They shuffled their feet. They studied their bidding cards. $1 a pound was the opening bid for average cattle. Hers were premium. They should have started at $120, $130. The silence stretched. It was thick with pity and a kind of grim satisfaction. "This is what happens," the silence said. "This is what you get for being stubborn." Finally, a buyer from a small independent feedlot in the back row raised a finger. "I got 90 cents, Deal said, his voice strained. 90 cents. Who'll give 95? 95? The bidding crawled upward by pennies. It stopped at 97 cents a pound, nearly 30 cents below the market price for vaccinated calves of the same quality. She had lost thousands of dollars in the space of 5 minutes. She collected her check from the office. The clerk, a woman from her church, wouldn't look at her. Elsie folded the check, put it in her pocket, and walked out into the autumn sun. She didn't flinch. She just drove home, the empty stock trailer rattling behind her. The years began to stack up. 1988, 1989. The world did not end. The mad cow plague did not arrive on American shores. The panic subsided, replaced by a new, bureaucratic normal. The vaccine became a standard part of herd management, like worming or fly tags. Form 77-B was just another piece of paper to be signed. And Elspeth Finch became a local legend, a cautionary tale, the crazy widow of Custer County. Her name was synonymous with lost potential. People pointed out her ranch as they drove by. "That's the double bar F," they'd say. "Used to have the best Herefords in the state. Now she can barely give 'em away." The market for her calves dried up almost completely. The big sale barns wouldn't even take them. The packers had official policies now. No unvaccinated animals. Period. She adapted. She had to. She found a small family-owned processing plant 3 counties over that catered to a niche market for natural beef. They didn't care about the vaccine. They paid less, but they paid. She started selling her steers directly to them, hauling them herself in the old Ford. She started keeping more of her heifers, growing her herd. The ranch was understocked. The grass grew tall and thick. It was a sea of grama, blue stem, and buffalo grass. Her cattle grew fat on it. Her isolation was complete. The phone rarely rang. No one dropped by for coffee anymore. The talk in the diner had moved on to crop prices and high school football. She was old news, a settled fact, a woman living in a museum of her own making. She didn't mind the silence. She had her work. She had the cattle. She had the land. She spent her evenings with the ledger, tracing bloodlines, planning her breeding pairs for the spring. Her goals were the same as they had always been. Good temperament, good mothering instincts, good weight gain on grass, a deep, hardy constitution. Her bulls were magnificent, great placid beasts with broad heads and powerful shoulders. She had 3 main herd sires, Double Bar Heritage, Double Bar Stalwart, and a young bull she'd raised herself, Double Bar Legacy. They were the culmination of her life's work. Out in the county, things were fine. The vaccinated herds were healthy. The calves sold for good prices. The system worked. Elsie's refusal looked more and more like a foolish, costly mistake, a gesture that had cost her everything and gained her nothing. The turn, when it came, was not a thunderclap. It was a whisper, a slow, creeping unease. It started in the spring of 1990. A neighbor, Tom Callahan, a man who ran 500 head of Angus, mentioned it at the feed store. His calving rate was down, just a little, from his usual 94% to 90%. "Just a tough winter," he said, shrugging. "Cows are a little thin." But Elsie had seen his cows. They weren't thin. The next year, 1991, the whisper got louder. More ranchers were complaining. Calving rates in the low 80s. A surprising number of cows that wouldn't breed back. Open cows. A rancher's nightmare. It meant a year with no income from that animal. A drain on resources. They blamed the feed. A bad batch of protein tubs. They blamed the mineral program. Not enough selenium. They blamed the mild winter. Maybe the bulls weren't active enough. They blamed everything except the one thing they all had in common. Elsie's calving season in 1991 was once again 95%. Her calves were like peas in a pod. Strong, healthy, full of life. Her open rate was less than 3%. Mostly old cows that she expected to cull anyway. She weaned her steers at an average of 700 pounds. On grass alone. She kept her records. She watched. She listened. She saw the vet trucks on the roads more often. Dr. Carmichael looked older, more tired than ever. He was drawing blood, sending samples to the university lab in Lincoln. The reports that came back were inconclusive. No infectious agents, no obvious nutritional deficiencies. The herds were by all standard measures healthy. But they weren't breeding. The spring of 1992 was the breaking point. The calving numbers across the county cratered. Ranches that had always been profitable were looking at disaster. 70% calving rates, 65%. Stories circulated of one large operation that had a 50% calf crop. It was catastrophic. It was inexplicable. The mood in the county was sour. Fear was back, but it was a different kind of fear now. Not of a foreign plague, but of a rot from within. The men gathered at the diner, but they didn't talk much. They just stared into their coffee cups, their faces grim. The value of their herds, their life's work, was evaporating. A cow that won't have a calf is just a border, an expensive lawn ornament. The university sent out a team of specialists, epidemiologists, endocrinologists. They descended on Custer County with their clipboards and their sample kits. They interviewed dozens of ranchers. They took feed samples, water samples, soil samples. They drew gallons of blood. They also visited Elspeth Finch. A shiny new university pickup truck rolled down her long driveway one afternoon in May. Two young men in clean jeans and university polo shirts got out. They were polite, professional. They asked her about her herd management, her feeding program, her mineral supplements. She answered their questions simply. She showed them her ledger. They took notes. They looked at her cattle, grazing peacefully in the spring sunshine. They saw the herds of healthy calves. They saw the shine on the cows' coats. They saw the placid power of her bulls. One of the young men, the endocrinologist, looked through her ledger, his eyes widening. "You're at 96% again this year?" he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. 97, if you count the twins that lived, Elsie said. He looked from the ledger to the cattle and back again. He flipped back through the pages. 1991, 1990, 1989. The numbers were all there. consistent, high. "Mrs. Finch," he said slowly, "I see from Dr. Carmichael's records that you never enrolled in the BSE vaccination program back in '86. "That's right," she said. "And you haven't vaccinated the herd with it since? Not at all?" "Not a one." The two men exchanged a look. It was a look that held the dawning of a terrible, unthinkable hypothesis. They asked to draw blood from a dozen of her cows. She obliged. She watched them work, their movements efficient and sterile. They thanked her for her time and left. She knew what they would find, or rather, what they would not find. The official report was released 6 months later. It was written in dry academic language. It spoke of unforeseen downstream endocrine disruption and long-term impacts on bovine reproductive viability. It mentioned the specific recombinant protein used in the vaccine. It noted a statistically significant correlation between multi-year administration of the vaccine and a progressive decline in fertility rates, particularly in Hereford and Angus breeds. It never used the word mistake. But the message was clear. The shield had been a sword. The cure had been a poison. A slow, subtle poison that had taken 6 years to do its work. The USDA quietly withdrew its recommendation for the vaccine. The program was halted. A new crisis began. How to rebuild the decimated breeding stock of the American heartland. The news spread through Custer County like a prairie fire. The shock was profound. The anger, the shame. The men who had laughed at Elsie Finch. The men who had pitied her. The men who had called her a fool. They were the fools. They had paid for the privilege of destroying their own herds. They had followed the experts, the government, the crowd, and it had led them off a cliff. There was only one person in the county, maybe the entire state, who had a large, viable, genetically pure herd of Hereford cattle that had never been touched by the vaccine. A herd with a documented multi-year history of 95% plus calving rates. A herd that was now, suddenly, priceless. The first truck came on a Saturday morning in early December. It was Tom Callahan. He drove his dusty Chevy slowly down her lane and parked by the barn. He got out, hat in hand. He was a big man, but he seemed smaller now. He didn't waste time with small talk. "Elsie," he said, his voice rough, "I need to buy a bull, and every heifer you're willing to part with." Elsie looked at him. Her face was calm, unreadable. She had been waiting for this day, not with glee, not with a desire for revenge, but with the quiet certainty of a farmer who knows the seasons will turn. She named her price. It was 4 times what a registered bull would have cost 6 years ago. It was a staggering number. Tom Callahan didn't even blink. He just nodded. "I'll take him," he said. After he left, more came. They came in a steady stream, a parade of dusty pickups and stock trailers, ranchers from Custer County, from Blaine County, from as far away as Cherry County, men with checkbooks in their pockets and desperation in their eyes. They didn't come to haggle. They came to buy. They wanted her bull calves. They wanted her yearling heifers. They wanted a piece of the only untainted bloodline left. She sold them. She sold Double Bar Legacy for a price that became a local legend. She sold his sons and his daughters. She sold them for enough money to pay off the mortgage, buy a new truck, a new tractor, and still have enough left to run the Double Bar F for the rest of her life without ever borrowing another dime. She never gloated. She never said, "I told you so." She didn't have to. Her vindication wasn't in the money. It was in the ledger, with its neat columns and consistent numbers. It was in the sight of her healthy cattle grazing on the winter pasture. It was in the deep, quiet knowledge that she had trusted her own eyes, her own hands, her own mind. She had listened to the cattle and the land, not the noise of men. The wind that winter still had a bite. It still rattled the windows. But to Elspeth Finch it sounded like a song. That's the legend, anyway. The story they tell in the sale barns and the diners. The story of the widow's folly that became the widow's fortune. But to understand why she did it, to understand the instinct that saved an entire region's stock, you have to go back. You have to understand the woman, the herd, and the land itself. Let me show you what they saw, and what she saw that they could not. The story doesn't begin with the vaccine. It begins with the grass, the foundation of everything. On the double bar F, there were 37 varieties of native grass that Elsie could identify on sight. Needle and thread, June grass, the tall, waving banners of big blue stem, the tough, essential sod of buffalo grass. She knew them not just by name, but by purpose. She knew which ones the cattle preferred in the spring, lush and full of sugar. She knew which ones cured best on the stem, providing standing hay for the harshness of winter. This was not abstract knowledge. It was tactile. It was a map of nutrition she carried in her head, learned from walking these same pastures since she was a girl, her hand in her father's. He had taught her that a rancher who doesn't know his grasses is just a man who owns some cows. He is not a cattleman. He is a gambler. Her father, Samuel, had been a man of few words and deep convictions. He had homesteaded this land. He broke the sod with mules, not a tractor. He believed the land told you what it needed, if you were quiet enough to listen. He was the one who brought the first registered Herefords to this part of the county. He chose them for their hardiness, their ability to convert native grass into beef, their placid temperament. He saw them not as a commodity, but as a partner in the difficult business of living on the plains. He kept meticulous records in a series of small, spiral-bound notebooks, a tradition Elsie would later transfer to her large, leather-bound ledger. When Elsie married John Finch, her father approved. John was a different kind of man, an agricultural science graduate from the University of Nebraska. He understood genetics, soil chemistry, and modern farming techniques. Where Samuel was instinct, John was intellect. The two men, for a few years, formed a perfect whole. John brought in new ideas about rotational grazing to maximize the potential of the native grasses Samuel had so carefully preserved. He introduced new sires from famous bloodlines in Montana and Wyoming, adding size and conformation to the hardiness Samuel had bred into the herd. John was the one who bought the big ledger. He said, "History matters, Elsie. We need to know where we came from, to know where we're going." He and Elsie would spend winter evenings at the kitchen table, transferring her father's old notes into the new book, creating the foundational document of the double bar F. It contained more than just birth dates and weights. It had notes on difficult births, instances of sickness, cows with particularly good mothering skills, calves that were exceptionally vigorous. It was a complete, multi-generational health record of a closed system. When John died, Elsie lost more than her husband. She lost her partner, her sounding board, her other half. The grief was a physical weight. For the first year, she just went through the motions: feed the cattle, check the fences, sleep, repeat. The county was right about one thing. The grief was real. It was a canyon. But they were wrong about what the grief did to her. It didn't make her stubborn. It made her essential. It stripped away everything that wasn't core to her survival, to the ranch's survival. She had to become both Samuel and John. She had to rely on her father's deep, intuitive knowledge and her husband's analytical mind. She sharpened her focus. She had to. There was no one else. She walked the pastures not just to check the cattle, but to read the story of the land. She noticed the subtle shifts in the grass composition. She saw how a dry spring favored the short grasses, how a wet summer brought up the blue stem. She learned to see the health of the land as a direct indicator of the health of her herd. She also studied the ledger. She didn't just record new data, she analyzed the old. She could trace the lineage of a calf born that morning all the way back to her father's original heifers. She saw patterns, a certain bloodline that produced smaller calves but had exceptional mothering instincts, another that produced large, fast-growing steers but whose heifers sometimes had trouble breeding as 2-year-olds. This deep, specific knowledge of her herd's strengths and weaknesses was her greatest asset. It was proprietary data. No university study could replicate it. It was earned. So when Dr. Carmichael laid the pamphlet for the new BSE vaccine on the counter in 1986, Elsie was not looking at a simple choice. She was looking at an invasion. The pamphlet talked about a recombinant protein. It was a phrase that meant nothing to most ranchers, but to Elsie, who had spent years balancing the delicate genetics of her herd, it was a red flag. It was an artificial element, an unknown, something created in a lab, far from the sun and the wind and the grass of Custer County. She asked Carmichael a question that afternoon, one he couldn't answer. What protein is it? What's its function in a healthy animal? He had looked at the pamphlet. It didn't say. The university extension agent didn't know either. The information was proprietary to the pharmaceutical company. It's safe, Elsie. It's been tested. That was the only answer they had. For her neighbors, that was enough. The fear of BSE was greater than the fear of the unknown in the needle. But for Elsie, it was the opposite. She had lived with the known risks of ranching her whole life. Drought, blizzards, market swings, predation. These were enemies she knew. This new thing, this recombinant protein, was an unknown enemy, and she refused to invite an unknown enemy into the heart of her operation. She was not a gambler. She would not bet 50 years of work, her father's legacy, and her husband's dream on a pamphlet and a promise from a stranger. Her decision was not born of grief-addled stubbornness. It was born of a profound, data-driven, and intuitive risk analysis. She was practicing a form of science older and deeper than the one that came in the vet's syringe. The first years of her isolation were harder than anyone knew. The financial loss at the sale barn was a brutal public humiliation, but the private struggles were worse. In the winter of 1988, the engine on her old Ford finally seized. She couldn't afford a new one. She bought a used engine from a salvage yard, and with the help of Jimmy, the high school boy, they spent 2 weeks in the freezing barn, swapping it out. Her hands were cut and bruised. She learned the feel of every bolt and hose. She learned the smell of gasoline and grease. She learned to be her own mechanic. That same year, a section of fence on her north pasture washed out in a spring flood. It was a half-mile stretch in a remote, boggy area. No contractor would take the job for what she could afford to pay, so she did it herself. She waded into the muck, setting new posts by hand, stretching the wire until her muscles screamed. It took her a month. Every evening she would come back to the house, covered in mud, so tired she could barely eat. But every morning she went back out. The fence was her responsibility. The integrity of her boundary was absolute. These struggles forged her. They burned away any remaining softness, any doubt. She was no longer just John's widow. She was Elspeth Finch, the sole proprietor and operator of the Double Bar F. Her identity was fused with the land and the animals. They were one. While her neighbors were taking their cattle to the vet for their annual booster shots, Elsie was practicing her own form of herd health. She spent weeks in the late summer and fall culling her herd. It was a ruthless process. Any cow that was a bad mother was sold. Any cow with bad feet was sold. Any cow with a difficult temperament was sold. She was selecting for resilience, for self-sufficiency. Her herd was becoming tougher, hardier, more adapted to her specific environment with each passing year. Her cattle didn't need to be coddled. They were survivors. This was the context for the turn. When the fertility problems began to surface in the county, other ranchers were at a loss. Their herds were dependent on a system of external inputs, supplements, vaccines, vet visits. When the system failed, they had no recourse. They looked for another input, another fix, a different mineral, a hormone shot, a new supplement. Elsie, meanwhile, was managing a closed loop. Her system was self-sustaining. The health of her herd came from the grass, from the genetics she had so carefully curated, and from her own relentless culling. Her 97% calf crop in 1992 was not a fluke. It was the logical outcome of her decisions. It was the dividend paid on 6 years of disciplined, lonely work. The vindication, when it came, was therefore more than just financial. It was philosophical. It was a validation of her entire worldview. The world of fast answers and technological fixes had failed. The slow, patient world of observation and stewardship had prevailed. When Tom Callahan stood in her yard, asking to buy a bull, he was asking for more than just genetics. He was asking for a piece of that philosophy. He was admitting that his way had been wrong, that the modern, efficient, expert-advised path had been a dead end. Elsie understood this. She saw it in his eyes. The price she named wasn't just for the bull. It was for the lesson. It was the tuition for an education he and the other ranchers were only now beginning. The price was high because the lesson was hard-won. It was priced in lonely winters, in busted knuckles, in public ridicule, and in the quiet, unshakable belief in her own judgment. She sold him the bull, a magnificent 2-year-old, the son of Double Bar legacy, a bull that represented the peak of her breeding program. As he was loaded onto the trailer, Elsie ran her hand along his flank. It was a gesture of farewell, but also of continuity. Her genetics, her philosophy, were now going out into the world to heal the damage. The Double Bar F was no longer an island. It was the source. Over the next few years, the genetic map of Custer County was redrawn. The Finch bloodline became the new standard. Ranchers would boast about having a grand